Hello and welcome back to this Downplayalistic Crusade. This video is my top 10 rankings for my all-time best Hammer horror films. And just like my Universal Horror list, this was exceedingly difficult to put together, so I had to primarily go on favorites, and of course I have great nostalgia for many of these films, and it's such a wide-ranging canon of different tonalities and really different eras within the run of main Hammer films. It's a much more vast thing than I think most people realize. And when you first get into Hammer, you'll notice very quickly, not only is it difficult to find all the films because of their various partnerships, it means they're broken up between different studios, but also outside of the two primary series of Dracula and Frankenstein films, the actual casts and crews and primary players sort of move around, and there are basically different distinct eras within the Hammer horror output. You have the early years, beginning with Curse of Frankenstein and basically running up until 1960s Brides of Dracula, somewhere around there. Then the second era really starting in 1961 with films like Curse of the Werewolf, and running through, I'd say, probably arguably Devil Rides Out in 1968. And then the third and last period of Hammer horror, when they basically started really trying to match the emerging trends of other films in America and Europe and increase the sex content and the gore and the nudity and things like that. And basically it began to dwindle in terms of quality and box office, until essentially the final nail in the coffin was 1976's To the Devil, a Daughter, which really signaled the primary end of Hammer films to that point, and especially that was the end of their horror output. Hammer did do other films, of course, before and after the horrors, and during them as well, with some really underrated classics in there. I should, of course, mention the fact that the entire notion of doing horror films was really spawned on by their great success with 1955's The Quatermass Experiment, which is the Val Guest-directed film adaptation of the BBC teleplay of the same name, written by Nigel Kneale. And that is a fantastically effective film. It's one of the great science fiction films of the 50s. And it also does have great horror elements, and that's what they sold it on, especially the fact that they wound up getting the X rating. So they used that to market and sell the film, and even, of course, put it in the film's title by spelling the word experiment with a giant letter X, taking the E off. That's why the film has the weird spelling, if you've ever wondered. That is, again, a fantastic film. I could have included it here, but I was trying to keep it to specifically just 10 films, and it was hard enough focusing on just the gothic horrors. So that's what I try to really stick to. And again, Quatermass Experiment, it has horror elements, but it's much more of a science fiction film, and it is told in a very realistic documentary, almost cinema verite style. So it does definitely stand on its own, but its great success put Hammer on the track, as it were, and basically everything changed with Curse of Frankenstein in 1957. So that means I tried to stick exactly to 10 of the classic Hammer horrors, and primarily their gothic horrors, which is what they're known for. And these films completely revolutionized the horror genre, which is basically defunct by the time Curse of Frankenstein came around. And they really pushed the envelope and, became the censor board's new nightmare. But they really achieved a style and eloquence that no one else has matched since. And it is the signature Hammer identity. And I also should note that all 10 of these films have several things in common. You do have most of the same key crew members and cast members that form really the Hammer family, but primarily all 10 of these films are directed by Terence Fisher, the great Terence Fisher, who is really the primary driving force, I think, of the Hammer Gothic horrors. I don't think that's anything anybody's going to squabble over, because you can tell the difference between the Terence Fisher films and the films directed by other people. Not to say that they're bad or lesser. There are great films that Fisher didn't direct for Hammer, but in terms of the horror output, it is really the films with the Terence Fisher stamp on them that are the core iconic Hammer horror films. So it's no surprise that in trying to limit it to just 10 Hammer horror films, all of them are directed by Terence Fisher. And it's also interesting to look at these and look at the differences in terms of when they were made. And again, the sort of crew change-ups that happen. Most Hammer films were scored by the iconic James Bernard, but not all of them. And it's interesting to look at some of the other composers' work. I think the other primary thing is, the genius of production and set designer Bernard Robinson being able to make magic out of absolutely threadbare, minuscule budgets and create these wonderful, incredibly intricate sets that feel real. And it's amazing when you find out how much these films were actually made for, which is next to nothing, particularly in the early days. And also, I think you will note the difference in cinematography, because the early films were shot by the incredible Jack Asher, who literally painted with color and light, and his black and white films were also majestic, but he did take a while to light things. So, of course, Hammer eventually decided to go for other cameramen and primarily switched over to Arthur Grant with Michael Reed as well, and what I like to call the second era of Hammer. And they still look beautiful, but it goes again to that level of just sheer intricate lighting that just is breathtaking, that you can just fall into and just find yourself studying for hours on end, that Jack Asher had. So that's another difference. And it's fascinating looking at the whole Hammer horror canon and seeing how things ebbed and flowed and changed, and when they would try science fiction, and the pirate films they made that some have a little bit of horror tinges to them. Also, the historical adventure films that they made, which I think is probably the best way to describe those. Some of those definitely do have horror elements. Like, for example, The Stranglers of Bombay, which is a fantastic film that definitely has plenty of nastiness and gruesomeness right out of a horror film. But they got away with it because it was a historical adventure, and they were, telling things that actually did happen. But of course, playing it up for the gruesome aspects of their horror fans. So it's far more than just the Gothic horrors, and the Gothic horrors themselves of Hammer are extremely varied, and it's like Universal. It's not just a single identity where the studio kept making the same films over and over and over again. Each one has its own distinct identity, and you can see the various cycles. You can see the Dracula and Frankenstein series and the shorter Mummy series, for example, and how those changed over time. Hammer also did, like Universal, sort of do several different reboots in those series. They did 2 Dracula and Frankenstein films, and then essentially waited a little while and then sort of rebooted them to restart the series later on in the 1960s. And it's very much a reimagining or a rebooting of those, and the continuity is very non-existent to the first 2 films of each series. And it's fascinating to see how they did this, and they played around with it, and they had different screenwriters at different times. So you see Hammer grow and change with the times, and it is sad to see the later films where you can tell the critical reception, the popularity has gone away, and so they're still soldiering on, as it were. And it's just, again, far more of a extremely varied history to these films than most people would imagine. Again, exactly like Universal. Again, as I mentioned, since the films are broken up by different studio ownership, it is extremely hard trying to track down all of them, and different releases exist in different countries due to further rights ownership. It's also very difficult in locating. You have to do your due diligence and trying to make sure you've got the best possible version of each film. Some have been restored well, some have not been restored well, and then some have had restorations or new scans supplant older versions that were not so good. So in terms of building a Hammer library or trying to see the films in the best possible format today, you do have to do a lot of hunting around and picking and choosing, and you have to do quite a bit of research. So for each film, I will also try and feature what I think is the best current version to watch and enjoy. So at number 10, I have 1968's The Devil Rides Out, directed by Terence Fisher, written by Richard Matheson, and Christopher Lee getting to star in the heroic role for a change. This is one of his best performances here as the Duke de Richelieu. This was a film he really wanted to make, and he convinced Hammer to try optioning some of the Dennis Wheatley novels. So this is a film that deals with a Satanist devil cult led by the absolutely fantastic Charles Gray as the film's villain Mokata, and it is very much not your typical Hammer fare. It has a real energy to it. It moves like no other Hammer film. I think that's courtesy of Richard Matheson's screenplay. And, of course, Matheson, I think, is one of the great literary minds, one of the truly great masters of science fiction and horror, author of some of the great novels, especially like I Am Legend and The Shrinking Man. But he really gives an energy to the film's plotting. It moves much more like an adventure film or a thriller, especially. It does have horror elements, and it builds to several set pieces that are just breathtakingly well directed by Terence Fisher. James Bernard's score goes above and beyond. The color photography by Arthur Grant is really something to look at. And it is known for not having the greatest special effects in the world. This is still Hammer. They never had the largest budgets around, but even knowing that going in, I've never really been put off by some of the ropier shots in the special effects. I think people make a bit too much of that. Yes, if you're looking for it, there are some shots that are kind of ropey, but it does tie into the film's atmosphere, so you're not paying attention to them as much. They don't stick out as much. But it is a beautifully crafted film that is about eloquence and intelligence and great storytelling. You do get a sense of the characters far more than most Hammer films, particularly the two lead characters of Lise de Richelieu and Charles Gray as Mokata, who is a phenomenal screen villain, really playing up the idea of making villainy attractive. And he's not always in his, Satanist garb. In fact, one of the absolute best scenes in the film is just him coming into a house and simply sitting down in the drawing room and talking to the lady of the house. And it's one of the most menacing things you'll ever see in your life. The film's central set piece is, of course, the magic circle scene, where the primary characters draw the magic circle on an empty floor and have to protect themselves against all of Mokata's evil plans to get them out of the magic circle. And it builds over time. It starts with the mundane. It starts with the things that are not supernatural and seemingly, commonplace. One guy thinks this is stupid and tries to leave. Another gets thirsty, and then the water has been contaminated, so he has to get up and he's going to leave and get water. It's things like that, and it builds to an amazing climax and degree. Again, the special effects are not the greatest in the world, I will admit that, but the film's impact is just fantastic. Again, I think a great deal of credit must go to Richard Matheson's screenplay, who really tightens and drops a lot of things from the original novel and heightens the tension and really gives a driving force, an engine that gives energy to the film's plotting. So it moves like a thriller. It starts from the get-go, right from the opening credits, which are fantastic and extremely atmospheric. Now, this is the Shout Factory Blu-ray release. This, I think, is the best version currently that exists in the world. It has both the Studio Canal Master from Europe, which has, unfortunately, quite a bit of DNR, digital noise reduction, and it has redone CGI special effects, which they're nice. It's nice that they tried that, but they did not include the original effects in that version in Europe. So Shout Factory here have that as an alternate bonus, but they have done a new scan of the elements that Fox had. So you get a beautiful new scan of the film. Looks far superior to the Studio Canal version. It does have the original special effects, and again, everybody talks about them not being the greatest, but it's not, absolutely terrible or anything like that. But it does carry the U.S. title, which is The Devil's Bride. So if you're watching this and you come to that for the first time, you're going to go, why is they got a different title? It's because Shout Factory was forced to use the U.S. elements. does have the film's original mono mix, which sounds quite nice. There's a little bit of noise here and there, but nothing bad at all. And it has a boatload of fantastic extras from the usual people that have been appearing on the Hammer Films extras. So you get a fantastic amount of scholarship plus commentary. So it's a beautiful release, one of the better Shout Factory titles of Hammer horror films. Coming in at number 9, I have 1961's Curse of the Werewolf, which is surprisingly the only werewolf film that Hammer made. Again, directed by Terence Fisher, this time with a screenplay by John Elder, who was actually producer Anthony Hines under a pseudonym. He would do that a number of times. It is a surprisingly literate film, and honestly, it's really more of a historical drama. It's a werewolf story set in Spain, of all places, and it is based on the Guy Endore novel, The Werewolf of Paris. The funny story about the production of this film, Hammer was going to make an adaptation of Werewolf of Paris, and at the same time, because they liked to do 2 films back-to-back, or 2 films around the same time to try and save money, they were going to do a film called The Rape of Sabina, which was about the Spanish Inquisition. They found out that the Spanish Inquisition film that was going to raise too much furor with the church and the censor board and things, so they decided it was probably not a good idea to go ahead and do that. But they had already built the sets for it, and they had built this wonderful set of a Spanish village or town from the period. So the decision came that they would just go ahead with the werewolf film and just change it from Paris to Spain. Now, this definitely has less of things you expect in a werewolf film. You don't really see the werewolf in full until the very end. There's not a full-on transformation scene until the very end. And again, it is very much a historical drama. We see the entire life story of the cursed character played in his adulthood by Oliver Reed in his first major starring role, who is incredible in the film. And honestly, it's the film's decision to build this character's story by letting us see the conception and birth of this cursed child and seeing his first years in his adopted household. There are absolutely completely chilling moments. But again, it is very much a historical drama that is really striving for a poetic eloquence. That's what I found most surprising. For me, I don't really think there are a great number of truly great werewolf films. I think you really have Universal's original Wolfman, the first half of Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, that is like a true Wolfman sequel, and this film. I know people love American Werewolf in London and The Howling, and I enjoy those, and I find great things in them, but I think it's this film and the original Universal film that really have an eloquence to them. It builds to a really majestic ending. And again, it's extremely surprising. This, again, is much more of a historical drama, and you get the sense of the struggles between the classes, how the poor lived versus the aristocracy. The film has a lengthy opening sequence where we see a beggar come into town and essentially find his way into the court of the local magistrate who, gets displeased, and then the beggar is thrown into a dungeon and forgotten and left to rot. And that's how he basically takes on the characteristics of the wolf-like characteristics that manifest eventually in his cursed child or progeny. This film is quite dark, but it doesn't have a whole lot of blood and gore that most people associate with Hammer. It is, again, very much deeply rooted in a sense of the historical time and place. So this was a film I'd always heard about growing up, and you see the stills of the amazing Roy Ashton designed makeup for Oliver Reed as the werewolf. Again, I think this is the only makeup that's ever truly rivaled the Jack Pierce, Lon Chaney Wolfman makeup. But no one ever talks about how beautiful this film is, and I think it's that beauty and that eloquence and that steep, overwhelming sense of tragedy that makes it so special. And once you see it, it's a film you fall in love with. It's a film I feel I still have not seen every part of it. Like, I feel there's more for it to give, for it to reveal. So it's a film I absolutely adore returning to. Again, it's a true surprise from Hammer, and they would do this from time to time, come out with a horror film that really was much more than a standard horror film and much more than what it was being sold as. And I find it really ironic that this film was cut to ribbons by the British censors when really it has not terribly very much gore in it, especially compared to some of the other films, even from the same time period. So I think it's a very beautiful film, masterfully directed, beautifully scored, and beautifully shot. Again, it's amazing how little money Hammer made these films for. So this is the Shout Factory Blu-ray release. It has their lovely slipcover, which you can't always get on later pressings. And very nicely, they have reversible cover art with the original poster art on the actual Blu-ray case itself. An absolute boatload of special features, again, primarily from the same Hammer aficionados and experts. Two interesting, great commentaries this time around. And just, again, I'm really impressed with the way that Shout Factory has been fully committing to their Hammer releases, trying to get the best masters around. Their encoding isn't always the greatest, and sometimes I am a little frustrated with some of their discs, but this is one of the best they have released of their Hammer titles, and this is the version you want to see. Universal put their version out and the Hammer Blu-ray box set, but it's in the wrong aspect ratio. It crops off too much of the image. The colors seem a bit washed out. This is a revelation. It is a beautiful, stunning-looking film. Again, especially knowing how little money Hammer had. This is still pretty early, 1961, in their horror films, but it also shows the change from the Jack Asher years. I think this is one of the best Hammer horrors that Arthur Grant shot. I think it's one of the best shot non-Jack Asher films, but I can't help but wonder what it would have looked like had Jack Asher shot it. But of course, it would have meant that the film would have taken substantially longer since he was a much more intricate cameraman. But this is the version you want to have of this film. It is the best the film has looked to date. It looks stunning. I have a film I feel is truly underrated, and really the film that is the last of the Hammer Gothic horrors. The company would go on to make a few more films, culminating 2 years later into The Devil a Daughter. But for me, this is really the last Hammer horror film that's tried and true. It's the last Terence Fisher film. It's the last time Peter Cushing appears as Baron Frankenstein. Of course, I'm talking about 1974's Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, the final film in Hammer's Frankenstein series, the last of the 6 to star Peter Cushing, the last of the 5 to be directed by Terence Fisher. And it really is the last film of a lot of the key Hammer cast and crew. And it's really, it's a farewell to the Gothic horrors. It really is, and what started in The Curse of Frankenstein in 1957. And it's fitting that, of course, the Gothic horrors really start and end with Frankenstein. And there's a lot of callbacks and pulls, much more from the first 2 Frankenstein films than the later films, starting with Evil of Frankenstein. And, of course, it had been a few years again since the last Frankenstein film, Must Be Destroyed, in 1969. And you can definitely tell it is the later period Hammer, but they are trying once again to do one of their classic Gothic horrors. And there's a certain sadness to it, a certain poetic quality, because it is the last film, and they are really trying. The film was written again by Anthony Hines under his pseudonym of John Elder, and it does have the return of that very deep gallows humor that is confined primarily to the first 2 films. And there's a lot of Revenge of Frankenstein in this film when you really look at it, in terms of the setup is even similar. And it has a little bit of that sort of whimsical, dark comedy tone throughout, which makes it a rewarding experience, and even more befitting that it's the last of the true Gothic horrors that the company would make. And so for me, this is the real, final Gothic horror, and it is, again, even though the company would go on for a few more years making quote unquote horror films, this is the last one that I really identify as Hammer and really sticks out. And it makes the film all the more special because now the Baron finds himself, or we find the Baron, I should say, a disciple of his work gets thrown into a mental asylum, and then of course the doctor of the asylum turns up, and of course it's Frankenstein under another nom de plume, much like Revenge of Frankenstein. And he basically has his way with the place by blackmailing the director of the establishment, and gets to basically use all the various patients within for his own nefarious pleasures and work. Of course, the film's budget, since it is a late period Hammer film from 1974, the budget is not the greatest, and that definitely shows up in a number of places. Unfortunately, one rather unconvincing model, and some of the monster makeup itself, the creature design has been much maligned. I like the idea of it, but it is definitely the least convincing of the main six Hammer Frankenstein films. But once again, these films are more about ideas, so that stuff, while it is detrimental in some ways, it doesn't detract overall from the experience. And Peter Cushing returns in another majestic performance as the Baron, and once again giving a completely different reading on the character. And the film's ending is absolutely the perfect way to end this series and the entirety of Hammer's Gothic horror, because the Baron will never stop. It is a wonderful gem of a film. It's a film I've loved ever since the first time I saw it. It was actually the second Frankenstein film I saw from Hammer's cycle, so I saw them completely out of order, and I immediately latched on to this very innate quality of sadness. It is a farewell. It is a goodbye film. It is basically it's a love letter to the Hammer Gothic horrors, is what it really is. And it was a return to form in an era where Hammer was really they had to double down on the sex and gore to keep up with everybody in America and every other company or Amicus or all their competitors. So it was refreshing to at least see one time where they went back to what they were known for and what they were best at. And I think it's also befitting that, of course, again, it was the last time Peter Cushing would play Baron Frankenstein, and the last Terence Fisher film. So it fits in so many different ways, and it's that very special quality that just makes the film so endearing and makes it so important. And it is a great film. It's a film about ideas, once again. It's one of those films that you want to immediately see the next film in the series, but unfortunately there just wasn't one. So it's a film I feel is very underrated, and it's one of those that if you love it like me, you really, really love it. And it's just all the more special because it is the last true Hammer Gothic horror film. So in terms of video releases, there are, of course, some that are finally uncut or more uncut. There are a number of little tiny trims here and there, as most Hammer films had. Unfortunately, what we have here in the U.S. is the cut version. It's not really compromised, but it would be great to have those extra little bits. Unfortunately, I missed out on the German and British Blu-rays. The British one in particular, that is now unfortunately out of print, was uncut and is the best release to date. So what we're stuck with here is the Paramount Master, that is the U.S. cut version. And so we had on DVD and Blu-ray for years. Unfortunately, Shout Factory kind of dropped the ball on this one, or they didn't have another choice because they didn't get to use the British master or the German master for the film. They had to, but they wound up using what looks like the identical Paramount DVD master. So unfortunately, that Blu-ray, while it has some nice new extras that I would love to check out, it's just an HD bump of the DVD. So I've still got my original Paramount DVD, and this does have a pretty nice commentary on it. So this was one of the few Hammer releases in this era of DVD that actually had an extra. It's anamorphic. It looks pretty good. It still holds up rather well, but unfortunately, the Shout Factory version is just basically an HD bump of this master. So don't go into that expecting it's going to be as fantastic looking as some of their other Hammer releases. Unfortunately, the British version is probably the best, and it is long out of print and very pricey. So I'm hoping somebody comes along and does another version, and this would be an amazing indicator release for one of their Hammer box sets. I'd also like to mention, just in passing, that Monster from Hell really is sort of a blending of multiple Frankenstein films in terms of their ideas. It's sort of a grab bag, being the last film. So, as I mentioned before, you have quite a bit of Revenge of Frankenstein in this film, and it's gallows humor in its plot setup. Maybe a little hearkening back to Curse of Frankenstein as well, a lot of the first two films. And then also elements of Frankenstein Created Woman and Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, I would say. So it's sort of a nice blending, and that's great for it being the sort of final grace note to cap off the series and Hammer Gothic Horrors. So at number 7, I had to do a lot of jostling around. These lists are impossible to do, and I'm really struggling to rank them and to pick specific favorites. At number number 7, I have what I think is unquestionably the darkest film the studio would ever make. This film is a powerhouse that is much more of a intensive character drama with elements of the suspense thriller. And again, as with all the rest of the Frankenstein series Hammer would do, the film is about ideas, and it builds to a third act with the quote-unquote monster of the film that is full of just multifaceted intellectual questions and moral queries, and it is just it's doing also pieces of the novel that have never been done, of Shelley's original novel. But it is an absolute piece of work, and that, of course, is 1969's Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. What a fantastic title. Peter Cushing again returns as the Baron in his most completely unhinged, completely without humanity in terms of his characterization of the Baron. Here, the title is apt. Frankenstein's pursuit of his goals have been thwarted for so long that he has lost any vestige of humanity and is now the ultimate villain. And it is his pursuit of his goals and his destruction of every single person that comes into his orbit, really. Everyone he ever connects with is ultimately destroyed in more ways than one. It is an absolute, just beyond cynical experience. It is unrepentingly dark. It's almost impossible to even like Cushing's Baron anymore, because the genius of the series is finding that balance of Frankenstein is a complete bastard starting in Curse of Frankenstein. He is the villain you love to hate, but it's that quality that Cushing had, and that the elements and little bits of gallows humor and those little last vestiges of humanity that always made us like him so much. But all that is minimized here, and he is absolutely without remorse. It again stands alone in the entirety of the Hammer canon. It's a film that must be seen. Unfortunately, it's still kind of confined to Hammer fan circles. But again, it is the darkest film I think the studio ever made. It is one of those films when you see it for the first time, you really can't believe what you're seeing. It definitely fits in perfectly with the cinematic upheaval of the new Hollywood. It is one of the great films of 1969, but it being a Hammer Frankenstein film and having that title means that nobody gave it a second glance. But it is, again, unrepentingly dark. For me personally, it's only marred by one real thing, and that is the inclusion of what was termed the need of to have a sex scene for the American financial backers. And it basically became they inserted a rape scene that definitely feels out of place, and Terence Fisher and Peter Cushing and everyone fought against its inclusion, but ultimately they were forced to do it. And it is done in a way as a means of showing the Baron attempts at psychologically manipulating and controlling those around him. So it actually is made to fit within the extremely dark confines of the Baron's actions in this film. But it still is off-putting, and it was not included in most prints of the film. And it's one of those times you get to a certain scene in a film that really was not supposed to be there. And of course, it's never referenced again. It doesn't completely derail the film, but it is one of those that I really wish there was a branching version where you could watch the film without that. Again, I just think it's an incredibly powerful film, and it has some of Terence Fisher's best ever suspense work. There are scenes in this film that are worthy of a Hitchcock film, probably the most famous and best of those, when there's a corpse in the garden of the apartment, and the Veronica Carlson character is absolutely terrified of what's been going on and what Frankenstein has been up to, and knows there's a body out there. And then she comes back home, and all of a sudden a water main breaks, and the water starts coming through, and the crews start coming in to repair it. And then before they get there, in her absolute terror, through the dirt that starts to move with this big geyser of water coming from the ground, you start to see the inevitable. You start to see the fingers of the dead hand of the corpse come through, and then she goes into absolute hysterics. It's one of many sequences in this film that is just it proves Terence Fisher's mastery of the cinematic medium, and in just a completely, if any film should ever be classified as dark, it is this film. It is Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. Again, I think without question, the darkest film the studio would ever make. And the horror is in, once again, the actions of Frankenstein, the lengths that he will go to, and what happens to all the people in his orbit, whether they are in on his scheme or not, and what he does in terms of brain transplanting, and what that does to the individual people who have then physically met their new fate at the hands of Frankenstein and his practices. So it's a film full of ideas. It's a film about ideas, which is what Hammer did best and better than anyone. In terms of video releases, the best you can do is currently the Warner Brothers Blu-ray, which I have here in their original Hammer Horror Classics box. And of course, it's one of those Blu-ray book type designs. So here is, of course, the section for the film. Unfortunately, for a film that really deserves a ton of special features like the other excellent Hammer releases, there aren't any on here outside the trailer. And the transfer, it's good. It's better than the DVD, but I do wish it was like a brand new scan and looked a lot better. This film really deserves 4K treatment. It is one of the gems of Hammer horror, and I would just love to hear some of the Hammer experts do a commentary for the film, or really talk about the ins and outs of it, because it is absolutely fascinating. Then at number 6, we really move in the complete opposite direction. Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed is a film without any sense of hope, whereas this film, I think, is all about hope and the spiritual. It's really a singular film in the Hammer canon. There's nothing else quite like this, and it's another, like Must Be Destroyed and some of the other Hammer films, that you could possibly classify as another genre entirely. The horror elements are much more about the ideas, but here, this film is all about the spiritual. It, again, like Must Be Destroyed, is a complete surprise, and honestly, one of the most surprising of all Hammer films. Again, there is no other film quite like 1967's Frankenstein Created Woman, once again directed by Terence Fisher. This was his return to the series after the 1964 Evil of Frankenstein, which is, I think, it's without question the 1 week entry of the Peter Cushing starring Hammer Frankenstein films. But for Created Woman, it definitely has the sort of style of Anthony Hines' screenplay writing, but I think it's one of his best scripts because you're immediately thrown into the action. We get a really fantastic first appearance of the Baron Frankenstein, once again working on his latest invention. But here we have him in a nice setup. You have Thorley Walters as the kindly town doctor, sort of the absent-minded professor type, having to be Frankenstein's assistant for physical reasons. And we also have the secondary assistant, Hans, who is one of the young couple that must always be in some sort of Hammer film. But the way the film is structured, you're immediately thrown into the experimentation. We see what the Baron's up to. We see he's got a different goal this time. He's now no longer obsessed with trying to reanimate dead body parts in terms of a form. He's already done that. He's moved on here to actually trying to isolate, understand, and extract the soul itself. So that sets up the film's very spiritual themes right off the bat. And it's a really interesting idea that now Frankenstein is, with this pursuit, if he manages to pull it off, his entire reason is simply to conquer death itself. It's no longer, enough to simply bring a creature to life. He's done that already, whether people believe him or not. So it's doing all this. Does so in the first 10 to 15 minutes, and then by following the Hans character, it brings us to the story of Hans and Christina, the young lovers of the film, and their very tragic backstory. And the film has a sense of impending doom that is not going to end well for practically anybody. And it builds and it achieves this, but then it goes on from there in terms of what Frankenstein actually does by transplanting the soul of one character into the body of their betrothed. It's absolutely a brilliant conceit. And then again, what the film does with this and the sort of atmosphere it creates, it feels very lived in, and there's this wonderful humanistic quality. It is the Baron in one of, shall we say, his lighter moods. He's much more approachable, much more humanistic. There are some maybe twinges of the first two Frankenstein films, again, in terms of a little bit of gallows humor and a little bit more of, and the Baron not being so unrepentingly a villain. But it's just one of those films, every time you come back to it, it just weaves its spell over you. And again, there's nothing like it in the Hammer canon. It's one of Scorsese's favorite horror films, and I think that really says a lot, because it is entirely about emotion. And coming off the disappointment of Evil of Frankenstein into this film, I don't know if there is a stronger film-to-film uptick in quality than going from the rather mundane and unfortunately dull Evil of Frankenstein to Frankenstein Created Woman. Terence Fisher achieves a level of emotional depth and texture in all of the performances across the board. Every character is fully realized, and you really feel for all of them. And this culminates in an ending that is completely on point, but entirely understated. It's one of the most shockingly understated endings to any film I've ever seen, let alone for the 1960s. It's one of the great endings to any Hammer film, and it really puts you right there in the same mindset as Baron Frankenstein. You literally have the same expression that he has on your face as the end credits start to roll. It's an absolutely beautiful film, and it is completely unconcerned with being about gore and the traditional ideas of horror. Here, the real horror is in the society itself and what human beings do to each other. And this is set up right from the opening pre-title sequence, which is actually quite long, where it's a flashback where Hans sees his father being guillotined. The guillotine being the reoccurring, looming figure over the town, and again, sort of harkening back to the guillotine opening Revenge of Frankenstein and closing Curse of Frankenstein. Well, here the guillotine's back in its proper place, right there in the credit sequence in the opening and throughout the rest of the film. So the specter of death is haunting the entire film. But it is just one of the most surprising films you will ever see. It's a horror film that is about ideas and about the spiritual. And there is nothing else like this film. It is just a beautiful experience, absolutely tragic, and just another and the Baron Frankenstein's never-ending quest to achieve his goals and finally achieve some recognition. But of course, he will always be denied. Currently here in the US, we have the beautiful Shout Factory release. This has the awesome slipcover with new art, and then the reversible sleeve with original poster art. As with all of these, they did do a new scan. It does look beautiful. The mono sounds pretty good. And then there's a whole great amount of extras with audio commentaries as well. So this is the version you'll want to go ahead and get, and you'll be able to replace your older versions. The only thing is Anolis or Annalus, or I don't know how you pronounce the label's name for sure, but the German label that's been doing all the deluxe Hammer special editions, they use this same master, but then they added a really interesting looking pair of documentaries. So if you want all the extras, you will have to get their version, which I think was just released last year. But if you get this, you'll be pretty set. The only problem I have with this transfer, though, as beautiful as it is, it does seem like some of the day for night shots are not timed properly. And that is a problem that you'll notice with a lot of these newer scans, that Sometimes they don't really nail down the day for night look quite right, because it is a difficult thing to do. Different cinematographers did it differently. Some were better at it than others. Some films just never had convincing day for night effects. But I do seem to remember my older versions, not having that issue. That's the only quibble I have with this particular release, because otherwise it's absolutely beautiful and has fantastic extras and great art. And because I'm a nerd, I also have the beautiful Laserdisc from the Hammer collection that Elite Anchor Bay put out back in the 90s. And of course, these would all be the basis for their excellent Hammer DVDs, which would use these same Laserdisc masters. Show you the rear for a second. Unfortunately, this pressing does have a flaw. It is missing a tiny section. I can't remember if it's an audio dropout for for a minute or two, but I could be mistaken. So unfortunately, this release isn't perfect, but it is a really great Laserdisc, and then that was corrected when they made the DVD version, which is the one I had to watch for years. So at number 5 is a film that often gets overlooked because it's not quote-unquote a horror film, but it has the classic Hammer style. It's from the initial golden age period of Hammer horrors. It has the key team coming off of Horror of Dracula coming into this film, and it's a film I have loved from the first time I saw it, and it is the film that I always start my yearly watching of October horror films in terms of marathoning classic horror films. So every October I always start with this film, which is just a beautiful picture that doesn't get enough credit. And that, of course, is 1959's The Hound of the Baskervilles, which is Hammer's attempt at doing a Sherlock Holmes film. And also, as a giant fan of Conan Doyle and the original stories, for my money, this is actually my favorite in terms of a straightforward adaptation of the original Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes character. I absolutely think Peter Cushing is the best live-action Sherlock Holmes we've ever had, and he was a great fan of the character and brought his intensive background and research that he would bring to every performance into Sherlock Holmes, and trying to bring the Hammer film adaptation as closely in line as possible with the original Conan Doyle text. So he has a lot of the proper mannerisms and props and things that the actual Sherlock Holmes of the stories does. And in addition to this, Andre Morel as Watson is my favorite on-screen Watson. I think he is absolutely fantastic. And it was really the first time that we had a Watson that was not in the Nigel Bruce mold of the Basil Rathbone Fox and Universal Holmes films, which themselves are classics, and I adore those as well. But there's an energy here because this is Hammer in their prime, really, and you have the beautiful Jack Asher photography, atmosphere that goes on for days, the strength of Terence Fisher's direction, James Bernard's score. And even though they had to condense everything down, I think by this point, Hammer had really made an art form of condensing great novels down to a very manageable 80 some odd minutes that they could make by reusing some sets and with their absolutely, threadbare budget. So most Holmes purists will see this film and immediately just recoil in horror at all the changes made. But it does keep the film fresh. It does get across the spirit of the original Hound of the Baskervilles, even though there are great changes made to the plot, and right down to changing around the villain a bit. And it does make it a surprising watch the first time you see it, because if you come from the original story, it definitely doesn't end quite the same way. But the atmosphere is there. I think this film also gets the energy of Conan Doyle's stories, which is something that I feel most adaptations really miss. The energy of when the game becomes afoot, that drive that really is coming from the Hammer style in their golden age. So you can definitely tell this is coming off the heels of the success of Horror of Dracula. This is one of those films that I've seen so many times that it's entered into my personal lexicon. I quote the film, I think of it always, and it's one of the most endearing Hammer films for me. It's also excellent because you get to see Christopher Lee play the heroic lead role as Sir Henry Baskerville. So he gets to just shake off the usual trappings of his typical typecasting and he's really enjoying himself, which is great. The film is also peppered with great British character actors and many Hammer regulars, right down to a great Miles Mallerson performance. And it's also interesting because we get the whole opening is the flashback of the actual legend of the Hound. So we open with an extraordinarily atmospheric opening of Sir Hugo Baskerville and the chasing of the poor girl across the moors with the hounds at night. Again, setting up the atmosphere of the film right off the bat, and also really prefacing the sort of historical dramas Hammer would move into. The opening of this film is very much mirrored in the Spanish set historical atmosphere of Curse of the Werewolf 2 years later. So you definitely feel that linkage there. It's a film that definitely has great intentions, and it is just a crying shame that Hammer never did another Holmes film, because this film is so outstanding that every time you see it, you're wanting to go to the next Hammer Holmes film, and then you're like, oh, they never did another one. Oh, crap. You can picture maybe what Hammer would have done with The Sign of Four, for example. That would have been amazing, with Peter Cushing and Andre Morel returning as Holmes and Watson. And, of course, Hammer would have played up some of, definitely played up and added to the horror elements and condensed the story down. But again, for me, this is the best straightforward Holmes film because it so adheres to the spirit of the original Conan Doyle stories, and that's why I love it so much. Even though it changes a whole heck of a lot. And of course, there's no tarantulas in the original story. I've always wondered if that was an influence on Dr. No, the fact that the tarantula is used in that way. And of course, Dr. No would be, 3 years later in 1962, and of course had a tarantula suddenly crawling around instead of the novel's Deadly Tropical Centipede, which is absolutely horrifying. So in terms of editions, your best bet is absolutely the Arrow Films release from the UK. So you will need region-free capability. It's still an older master, but it is light years ahead of the MGM non-anamorphic DVD, which is a port of their hard-to-find Laserdisc. There is a nice amount of extras. It ports over all the MGM DVD extras. And again, the transfer is light years ahead of the non-anamorphic DVD, but it's obviously an older master, and the sound has always been a bit harsh on all the video releases. So this is a film that I would hope someday could get a 4K restoration, but it is admittedly much more of a genre favorite. It's not one of the most iconic Hammer films, but it's up there, and it really deserves it. It's one of the best Sherlock Holmes films, period. It's my favorite of the ones that are doing a story straightforward and aren't trying a revisionist angle. I think the best Holmes film ever made is the Billy Wilder masterpiece, Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, which also stars Christopher Lee in a great atypical role as Mycroft. But for straightforward Holmes films, my favorite is this, Hammer's Hound of the Baskervilles, and this is the version to get. Here in the U.S., there was a Twilight Time Blu-ray that doesn't have all these extras. It has its own commentary. It's the same master, but like most Twilight Time discs, it's out of print and very expensive. So this would be the best way to go, but you will need region-free capability. So moving on to number 4, this is where I think there's at least one or two upsets. I kept playing around with this ranking so much that I always feel it's hard to have anything at the top, but the really what are I guess are known as the Hammer Big Three, the Big Three in their initial period, their Big Three classic Gothic horrors that sort of spawned series to come. But there's one particular film I adore so much, so it's sort of pushed and messed around with my rankings. So at number 4, I actually have one of the Big Three. This is one of the truly iconic Hammer horror films that you can't go in October without revisiting, and it is really the only other truly great masterpiece film based around the Mummy character. So, of course, I'm talking about Hammer's 1959 The Mummy. Once again, directed by Terence Fisher, gorgeously shot by Jack Asher. It's one of the most beautiful Technicolor films I think you could ever see, and starring, again, Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. this film beautifully distills down most of the Universal mummy mythos, because, of course, by this point, Universal had made a deal with Hammer, and Hammer could pull from and utilize the Universal elements, whereas before they had to go out of their way to not use them for fear of being sued. So here, Jimmy Sangster just brilliantly distills down and takes elements from the original 1932 Mummy film, from the 1940 Mummy's Hand, and from the 1942 Mummy's Tomb. So really, this is a film that has the background of the original Mummy film and the sort of lost love, but it is really taking the gist of the Mummy's Hand in terms of the archaeological dig, and the bulk of the film is really a remake of the Mummy's Tomb, but instead of the priest character and the mummy going to the New England, it's going to England, and it's still a period Gothic setting. So it fits perfectly in Hammer's typical milieu, and it just has a particular pace, just like the original 1932 Mummy film. It stands alone even in the Hammer horror films in that same way the 1932 film does. It is a bit more deliberately slow-paced. It has an otherworldliness to it. It has a certain poetic quality that, of course, fits in with all the flashbacks. The primary one being the fall of the character played by Christopher Lee and his attempt to raise his lost love from the dead, which itself is beautifully striking. And even though it's a longer sequence, Hammer really tried to go for the as much of an authentic Egyptian funeral procession as possible, which is fascinating to see with the usual beautiful Hammer production design and photography from Jack Asher. It's amazing to see what they did in this film with their typical not the greatest budget in the world. And again, it's a perfect distillation of everything Universal did, and has none of the stupid stuff of the later 40s films in terms of what they turned the Mummy series into. So for me, as much as I love The Mummy's Hand, I think that's a very good film. It's a film I adore. The Hammer 1959 Mummy film is the only other truly great Mummy film to stand alongside the 1932 original starring Boris Karloff. And again, it's the perfect distillation of all the Universal films. I think this is the one film that truly benefited from Hammer being able to pull from the Universal films, because I think otherwise it was really a detriment, because they were no longer forced to be creative to avoid Universal stuff as much as humanly possible, as on Curse of Frankenstein. So here, it's, again, all credit would have to go to Jimmy Sangster for pulling this together and finding the perfect way to blend the Universal Mummy films into a complete original. And it has some of the great set pieces in all of Hammer horror. I think the signature one would be when Peter Cushing's Banning character, complete with broken leg to give an extra added element to Cushing's usual physicality, knows the mummy will come for him next, and just waits patiently in his grand study with shotgun over one arm and smoking in the other for the mummy to suddenly burst through. But he knows it's coming. There's many great, beautiful, suspenseful moments there. Also, there's a fantastic, hero and villain talking about other things and under the surface of civility. There's one of those great type scenes, and really almost in ways sort of prefacing the classic Bond and Bond villain scenario in terms of conversing about the plot at hand, but in misdirecting terms in the air of civility. So it's a beautifully mounted film. It is somewhat slower. So again, most people will either, if you're not able to get on board with that, that leads to some criticism of the film. Some people say the main flashback in the middle of the film is a bit too long as well, which I can understand. But I think by that point, the film has woven its spell over you. So it's a film I always enjoy returning to. And it is centered around another classic Peter Cushing performance, and Christopher Lee as the mummy is absolutely majestic. We do get to see him in the flashback pre his mummy guise, and it's amazing even there what he does with his performance in terms of the things that are not said, what he does with his eyes, and that sets up the supreme characterization of when he is playing Kars the Mummy. And of course, in the Universal films, Kars the Mummy was just the lumbering giant who was unstoppable and had no real humanity. But here, Lee just injects a humanity in spades, and entirely with his eyes and his body and his movement. He has nothing else to work with, and it's as amazing of a performance as his performance as the creature in Curse of Frankenstein, which was also wordless. He had an ability to convey emotion with just physical gestures, and again, it's all in his eyes. I mean, his eyes as the Mummy just speak volumes of his centuries of pain and agony. It's just absolutely incredible. So this is a beautiful film I always enjoy returning to, and it is the third of what are termed the Hammer Big Three in terms of Curse of Frankenstein, Horror of Dracula, and The Mummy. In terms of editions, you will want to look at this on Blu-ray because the HD transfer is really stunning and reveals even more of Jack Asher's truly staggering, intricate photography. With the Hammercaller horror films of this era, Jack Asher really elevated himself, I think. He was already a great cameraman, but these are so iconic and so groundbreaking. I really do think Jack Asher was one of the great cinematographers of all time, and these films really show it because they all build upon each other. And The Mummy coming after the first couple films, you can see there's an even greater intricate depth to the color photography, and he got even more bold in his color choices, and there's a very incredible and beautiful somber quality to a lot of the color, which itself is stunning even compared to the earlier films. So Warner Brothers reused the same master that was on the British Blu-ray. So I have the US Blu-ray here again in the Horror Classics box, but unfortunately it doesn't have any of the extras on the UK release, and that version is out of print and now very expensive. So if you want the great commentary and extras, you will have to pay through the nose and try to find a copy of that. However, because this doesn't have any of the extras and things, the actual encoding and the bitrate is a little bit better on this just bare bones Warner disc. And again, because I'm a nerd, I was able to manage finding the Warner Brothers Laserdisc. See if I get the glare off. They did do Laserdisc for this era for a number of their Hammer films, but of course, this being earlier in the video era, this is pretty much opened up from the original 166 matting. So this is a 133 transfer. This is how you would have seen the film growing up on VHS or cable airings or Laserdisc. And all of the Warner Hammer films, in terms of their LD releases, are quite uncommon to find. I still can't find the Horror of Dracula one. That one still eludes me, but The Mummy is also quite rare, so I was very happy to find this, even though it is just a direct print transfer and it is in the 1:3 ratio. It is still a nice, for lack of a better term, a nice artifact from the video era to see this film, how it used to be presented. At number 3, I have the film that has risen the most in my estimation, and I think the secret hidden gem of the entirety of Hammer horror. This is a film that so bowled me over the first time I saw it, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I think it's one of the absolute greatest sequels of all time, and it unfortunately was the second of this particular series that really, like the Dracula series, the Frankenstein series has the first 2 films that really are linked and form their own sort of unified cycle. And then when the films restarted years later, it was always different. It was never quite the same. So I am talking about 1958, The Revenge of Frankenstein, which is Hammer's first Gothic horror sequel, a direct follow-up to The Curse of Frankenstein, and made for Columbia this time under a new deal, meaning that Sony has had the film and most of the transfers have always been quite good for it. This film is really all about the gallows humor much more. It has a great deal of what I like to term the sort of impish and cynical Jimmy Sangster humor, which comes through quite a bit in Curse of Frankenstein, but it is restrained to a degree. Here in Revenge of Frankenstein, it comes to the fore, and that combined with Peter Cushing returning for another career-defining performance as the Baron, but going for, again, a film about ideas. This almost is my favorite Frankenstein film. I think Curse just slightly eclipses it because it is the classic tried and true Hammer horror. But this one is probably the one that most appeals to me personally of all the Hammer horror films. I almost had this at number one, but you just can't quite overcome the classic status of certain films. But this one is just a complete joy from start to finish. It is extraordinarily complex in terms of his ideas. The monster character in question here in this film, because of course the Hammer Frankensteins follow the Baron and his adventures instead of following the same original creature over and over. Here, the monster per se is not monstrous at all. The Baron has perfected his technique and created a perfect physical specimen that looks entirely normal. But of course, the horror it comes from what will happen to this creature, the sense of foreboding that pervades the film. But it's also beautifully, not offset, but increased and enriched by the pervading sense of this gallows humor at its fullest extent in any Hammer horror film. And it is, I think, the richest Hammer film in terms of its complexity and its enjoyment factor, and I wish it was more often discussed because I do think this film is an absolute masterpiece from start to finish. You get Terence Fisher's brilliant direction and the brilliant design of Bernard Robinson, the gorgeous color photography of Jack Asher, and this is, again, everybody coming off the high point of Horror of Dracula, so this is everybody with that under their belt and feeling that supreme confidence that now they've got two great films behind them and they're doing fantastic work, and let's carry on forward. There's also additional elements to the script because Peter Cushing always pushed for better dialogue. He was never really a fan of Jimmy Sangster's dialogue, so there are some other writers who worked on the film, but it is still the central conceit and has the central Jimmy Sangster style, and it is perfectly linked to the original film because it is a direct sequel. It literally picks up where the first film ended, with the Baron being led to his death by guillotine. And it's a beautiful bit of continuity. So this is, I think, one of the great examples of a series adhering to its own continuity. The film has absolutely incredible performances outside of Cushing, and Francis Matthews is a great supporting character for the Baron. You have Richard Wordsworth as a very Dickensian character, this character of an up patient in the poor hospital. And the setup of how Frankenstein is carrying on his work. He's established himself in society, so he's learned a little bit of how to hide his internal demons from society by certain affectations, but in others he's just as ruthless as ever because his usage of this poor hospital for his own experiments is just absolutely chilling when you think about what he's doing. But it's also done in that sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge way that also is just very salacious. Again, that notion of the gallows humor that was in Curse of Frankenstein, but here in Revenge, it's at its fullest. But the other great central performance is really Michael Gwynne as the reincarnated monster character, and what happens to the poor, unfortunate character of Carl once he has been, essentially helped by Frankenstein, who has achieved his results. But of course, as we all know, it's going to go horribly wrong. But that does not stop the gallows humor, and this film builds to an absolutely unbelievable conclusion that is one of my favorite endings to any film ever made. That is perfectly in keeping with this film's tone and really caps off these two Frankenstein films as sort of their own two-film cycle. I think the great shame of all of Hammer horror is that we did not get a proper follow-up to the ending of Revenge of Frankenstein. I think it would have set up one of the most majestic comedy-infused horror films that would have ever been made. As it stands, I think this film has that title of comedy-infused great horror film. But it's such a shame that Hammer did not make a direct sequel to Revenge of Frankenstein because, again, it's one of my favorite endings to any film, even outside of the horror genre. It's an unbelievably, majestically beautiful, macabre, dark, but hysterically funny ending. Also just a little understated. It's one of those that is so completely unbelievable. When you first see this film, you're like, oh my God, are they going this way? And then you're like, oh my God, they are. They did. And it's just an absolute delight. I think this is one of Hammer's immortal masterpieces, and it's the one that is completely underrated because it's not often shown. It's under Sony, so it doesn't get sold with the other films in box sets and things, but it's absolutely beautiful from start to finish. In terms of releases, there really is one and only one, and that is the gorgeous Powerhouse Indicator release from the UK. This is also region free, so you can import this and you don't have to have region B. It was originally sold as this limited edition in the volume 4 box, but unfortunately that's long sold out. So the standard version will look just like this. All of the beautiful extras are still here, but you will lose the booklet and things. But otherwise, this is what you want to go for. It's one of the best Indicator releases ever, and it is the only way you can see Sony's breathtakingly beautiful 4K restoration of this film. This is a stunningly gorgeous disc that really shows off the intricacies of Jack Asher's color photography, which not all Hammer restorations really do a good job of. So by and large, I think this is probably the best overall looking Hammer Blu-ray, because it didn't have to deal with compromised elements and things, and it's just gorgeous, and it's complemented off by a fantastic extras package, as all Indicator Blu-rays do. You have most of the regular Hammer experts come on for there are 2 excellent commentaries here, tons of excellent featurettes and features on the film, and for me, I think it's perfect because this is the underrated Hammer horror film. I don't think there is one that is more underrated and underseen, and Sony has done a beautiful job at presenting this brand new 4K restoration. To see how the film used to look, I of course have the old Laserdisc as well. This one is also 133. It's got a lot of color, but it's actually too much. You can tell that whoever mastered this back in the day, it's a beautiful looking print, and seems to be the same one used for the already fine DVD, which was letterboxed. But here the reds are way too high, but otherwise it's still a beautiful looking LD. So of course I had to find this as well because I try to see all the old versions of my favorite films, and this is without question one of my absolute favorites in terms of Hammer horror, and maybe my own personal favorite Hammer horror of all time. But it's just slightly eclipsed by the towering titans of classic Hammer horror. But this is definitely the most undervalued, the most underseen, and this is the film that I hope people seeing this video, if you haven't seen all the Hammer horrors, this is the one I most hope people check out more, because it is an absolute masterpiece. So before moving on to my top 2, I figured I would do at least 2 honorable mentions, and this was such a difficult list to put together that I really am just still straining to try and get to just my pure top 10 Hammers, so I could have easily made this a top 20, and again, this is just simply focusing on the Gothic horror films, but I figured I had to at least spotlight 1 or 2 that would be the honorable mentions. So the first would be 1960's Brides of Dracula, the second in the Hammer Dracula cycle, and the second film in the sort of duology that starts both the Hammer, Frankenstein, and Dracula series. They each have 2 films that are directly linked and were made in that first Hammer golden age of Gothic horrors, and then it would be several years before they picked up again. But even though Brides of Dracula is now regarded as one of the iconic Hammer masterpieces, it is quite possibly the best looking film Jack Asher shot. It is built up and developed over what had been done, and is really like the capstone of probably the golden age of Hammer horror from the first few years up to about 1960, early 61. And Peter Cushing again returns as Van Helsing in an incredible performance, and it really is the highlight of the film, because there is no Christopher Lee as Dracula. There is no Dracula in the film, which is very well known by now, I would think. And David Peel does very well as the character created for the film of Baron Meinster. There is great atmosphere. There are iconic moments that you don't quite forget. well, you never forget really, but my problem with film has always been that particularly the middle section of the film kind of drags, and you don't quite have that spark of the Van Helsing versus Dracula that you have from the original film. So it is kind of missing something, but in terms of atmosphere, photography, Peter Cushing's lead performance, and iconic moments, it is up there in the top tier of Hammer's masterpieces. But it's just always kind of been held back a little bit for me because of the script, and the ending is great, but the original climax Peter Cushing in particular vetoed, and that was later reused for Kiss of the Vampire, which is a much more fanciful take on the vampire mythos. So there's a lot of fans of that film, and it's taking the Hammer vampire films in a different direction, and it is a standalone film outside of the Dracula series. But Brides of Dracula is sort of a picture at a crossroads. It has great ideas. It has the initial Hammer horror golden age cast and crew and mentality behind it, but I just have never felt that the script is quite there. Terence Fisher's direction is fantastic, and it really pains me that it's not here in my top 10, but with recent revisits of both Devil Rides Out and Curse of the Werewolf, it kind of got, those two kind of got elevated over Brides of Dracula for me this time. But again, the next year, if I try to make this list again, it will probably be completely different because, I love all of these films, as all Hammer fans do. Just like when I try to make a Universal Horrors list, it could change in the next month or the next week or the next time I even think about trying to rank my favorites. But Brides of Dracula is right there. It would be my number 11. It just barely missed my top 10. Currently, the best video release is the Shout Factory collector's edition of the film, which presents a new scan and multiple aspect ratios, fixing a lot of the problems of the prior releases. And Brides of Dracula looked fantastic on DVD from Universal, but the first couple Blu-rays were just really nasty looking with very brown looking appearances and frequently misframed at a cropped aspect ratio on the Universal disc in particular. And then other companies reused that master. So it was one of those where you really had to just stick with the DVD. Thankfully, the Shout Factory version is out with some fantastic extras, and that is the version to go for. However, it does suffer from some of their wonky encoding. So even though it has the preferred 1.66 to 1 aspect ratio, the encoding is so poor that you're basically watching a much lower resolution version with DVD quality lossy audio if you choose that version. So if you watch that disc, you will have to choose the 185 version instead, which is properly encoded with lossless mono. I don't know why Shout Factory included both ratios to begin with. The 166 would have been perfectly fine by itself, and most of their Hammer discs are fine, but there are some, like Brides of Dracula. I think The Reptile may be another one where the encoding is just not the greatest, and unfortunately, one version will get short shrift over another. That's the only real flaw of the Shout Factory release. Otherwise, it is wonderful. It's still the best release to go for, but do keep in mind, if you choose to watch the 166 aspect ratio version on that disc, you will take a massive hit in terms of both video bitrate and the audio fidelity in terms of the codec being used. Then what would probably be my number 12 overall was actually the first Hammer horror film I ever saw in its entirety, which is 1966's Dracula Prince of Darkness. Again, also directed by Terence Fisher, so of course my top 12 are all directed by Terence Fisher. And Prince of Darkness was the sort of relaunch for the Dracula series after the 6-year gap between the films. You basically have Brides of Dracula, my number 11, and then there was 6 years until Hammer took up the mantle of the Count once more, bringing Christopher Lee back as Count Dracula and bringing Terence Fisher back to the director's chair. This was really the second period of Hammer horror when they were really churning along under new studio deals and making their two-picture packages where they would shoot 2 pictures at the same time, reuse the same sets, most of the same cast and crew, and in order to minimize the budget expense. And then, of course, they would package these films in double feature bills, not the same ones produced together, of course, but they would mix them with films that had just been produced or would be produced shortly afterward. So, for example, Prince of Darkness was shot back-to-back with the great underrated Hammer film Rasputin the Mad Monk. But Prince of Darkness does have the wonderful atmosphere that Terence Fisher brought to these films. It has the sense of the Gothic, but it does have a greater sense of violence and gore in terms of the intensity. There are some fantastic sequences that do have a very surprising and shocking, in a way, additional usage of blood and gore that isn't there in the first two films. And it is befitting that it is 6 years down the road, and Hammer was already having to match the loosening of the ratings boards in both the UK and the US. Here, they still seem to have their finger on the pulse of that, and it would be another year or two when they would really start to get eclipsed. So by the late 60s into the early 70s, that's when they really started amping up the sex and gore, which is really to their detriment. So Prince of Darkness, I think, really represents that sweet spot of Hammer horror, that last sort of period where Hammer was really on top of the horror market. And unfortunately, this would be the last Dracula picture to be directed by Terence Fisher, and I think it really shows. For me, after Prince of Darkness, there is a massive drop-off in quality in terms of the Dracula films. I still do enjoy them, but you definitely feel the disappearance of Peter Cushing as Van Helsing. He wouldn't return until the seemingly terrible idea of Dracula AD 1972, but that picture does still manage to have a charm to it, even though the idea is a bit silly. Unfortunately, in Prince of Darkness, like most of the Dracula films, Christopher Lee is not given very much to do. In fact, he has no dialogue in Prince of Darkness at all, which is a very famous bit of trivia I think most people are aware of. But his presence alone is just domineering. We get the first appearance of the great able manservant Clove with a wonderful recitation of Dracula's ashes, and again in a very striking, bloody, but yet very cultured manner that's also got a little bit of the tinge of the great gallows humor that the earlier Hammer horrors really excelled in. I think it's a wonderful film, and again, I think it's the last truly good film in the Dracula series, though I do still enjoy watching films like Has Risen from the Grave and Taste the Blood of Dracula, and even AD 1972, Things in Satanic Rites, and Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. But Prince of Darkness has a great supporting cast. It has lovely photography from Michael Reed. It is the first Dracula film in the series to be shot in scope, although it was done in Techniscope, and has a fantastic score and one of the great endings to any horror film that completely burned its way into my brain as a child. I still vividly remember seeing it pan and scanned on cable when I had just accidentally found that this film was coming on, and it had Christopher Lee in it, so it was going to be my first Christopher Lee Dracula, and it was my first Hammer film in its entirety. And I still remember to this day the ending of Prince of Darkness and the final fate of the Count. It was like nothing I had ever seen before to that point, and the intensity that builds in the film is really fantastic. And I really think that without Terence Fisher, the Hammer Dracula films did really lose something, and that combined with Peter Cushing's absence until AD 1972 really hurt them, along with, again, the fact that they give Christopher Lee basically nothing to do but pose and posture wonderfully. So I've never felt the Hammer Draculas are as strong as their Frankenstein series, but I think the first three are the ones to really come back to over and over, much more so than the later films. But again, that's just my own personal opinion, which may differ from your own, but that's why I would have Prince of Darkness at my number 12. Again, Prince of Darkness would be best on video to see the Shout Factory Collector's Edition. Unfortunately, the Studio Canal European Master is loaded with digital noise reduction. It has a particular color palette, too, that seems maybe a bit too intensive, and it's just DNR'd to the max. It is not a pleasant experience. So Shout Factory actually did a scan of the best elements that Fox had. So the Shout Factory disc has both the U.S. scan of the vault elements that were here in the States, an interpositive, I believe, and then it has the Studio Canal Master. And even though the U.S. version is not in perfect condition, it does have a strikingly different color palette. It is from an interpositive, so it's not as pristine as the Studio Canal version. It is a little bit dark in places. It's not perfect. It's very much an as-is presentation. But again, the color palette is strikingly different, and of course that beautiful green structure is fully intact. So even though it is not perfect, and it is a bit dark in places, and it is an interpositive instead of negative source, it is miles ahead of the awful Studio Canal version. In fact, I hated that version so much, I was still watching my old non-anamorphic Anchor Bay DVD port of the Laserdisc Master. That's how bad the Studio Canal version is. It's just it's gross looking. I don't know why they did that to that film. The Studio Canal versions from that era of Hammer films are sort of a mixed bag. Some could be pretty good, but unfortunately some went to town with the DNR button and stuff like that. So at least you have the choice on the Shout Factory release plus nice extras, but that is my recommendation, and I think overall the best version of Prince of Darkness is to get the Shout Factory release and to look at the US interpositive scan. I think it gives a much better approximation of what the film looked like on release. It has the grain intact, it has the original mono audio, and I think the color is much better, even though it is a little bit dark in places. So do keep that in mind, and you also get a great extras package. So that I think is the best video version to date for Dracula Prince of Darkness. So moving on to my number 2 top favorite Hammer horror film. I did do a bit of back and forth on this. This one is, I think, such a landmark. It is very easy to think of this as the number 1, but as I'll get to in terms of my rationale, I think this is the solid number 2 overall. And that is, of course, 1957's The Curse of Frankenstein, the first of the Hammer Frankenstein cycle, the first time Peter Cushing played Baron Frankenstein, the first of the Hammer Gothic horrors, a landmark in the horror genre, one of the most important horror films ever made. And without this film, the horror genre as we know it today would not exist. This is the film that resurrected the entire horror genre, and of course was the first major horror film in full color. There had been, of course, the 2-color Technicolor films, Dr. X and Mystery of the Wax Museum from Warner Brothers back in 1932 and 1933, but by this point in time, those were, relatively forgotten. This was the first full-bodied color film in terms of the horror genre, the first to be iconic for its color usage, and broke new ground across the board in its color photography, its scoring, its direction, performance, writing, and real breaking down of censorship barriers and making the horror genre fresh and vibrant once more in a way that it really hadn't been for many, many years. I think there are probably 3 great landmark films are years in the annals of the horror genre, 3 points at which the genre was completely changed and furthered in the public eye. I think you have the films of the silent era for sure, but primarily the first big one would be 1931, where you have Universal release Dracula and Frankenstein, the first sound horror films that completely revolutionized the horror film and made it a popular, viable public entertainment. Then I think the next would probably be in 1942 when Val Lewton started his RKO cycle of B horror films with Cat People, directed by Jacques Tourneur, and basically invented the whole notion of the psychological horror film and really furthered what you could do with a horror film. And I think that after that, no one had really picked up the gauntlet and taken the horror genre any much further than Val Lewton or Universal had until Hammer Films decided to do a version of Frankenstein. And this, of course, after the success they had had with the film adaptation of the Quatermass Experiment in 1955, that did have some horror elements in it, even though it was a science fiction story. And by this point in the 50s, it was all about science fiction. So you have many films that are, have one foot in science fiction with some horror elements, so basically the sci-fi horror. Everything from giant bug films to Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Invaders from Mars. There's so many films like that sort of cross back and forth. But there weren't really specific horror films outside of the drive-in market or one-offs. And it was really The Curse of Frankenstein that just blew the doors open. And the film's importance cannot be overstressed, but I think a lot of people can focus on that now, and that's usually what you read about. But it's rare that you see people really talk about just how great of a film it is, how enjoyable it is, and how it manages to get great amounts of the spirit of Mary Shelley's original novel into a very short running time that had to deal with having a minuscule budget. It's very much it's a very intimate drama. There's only a certain number of major speaking parts. It's all primarily set in the Frankenstein household, which is based around only a handful of sets. But it brings together the key Hammer personnel James Bernard's score, Bernard Robinson's production design, and incredible usage of sets with very tiny amounts of money at the Bree Studios manor. The primary Hammer team that would become iconic of Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee in the lead roles. The cinematography of Jack Asher really testing what he could do with color photography in terms of the horror genre. I think the notion of Curse of Frankenstein as sort of being the litmus test of what Hammer could do is the perfect way to look at it, because later films would be more developed along different themes, but Curse of Frankenstein is sort of the foundation for everything. Jimmy Sangster's screenplay is absolutely brilliantly realized in terms of being both cheap and effective to make, but also really just wonderfully grisly and nasty in all the right ways without ever overdoing it, and having that great sense of gallows humor to balance out the nastiness. But also, again, themes from Shelley's novel that had not really been tackled by Universal or anybody else. A lot of moral questions are brought up, and the idea to focus on the Baron for the rest of the series and to make him just a nasty piece of work that could be reflective of different elements of his characterization in different films. So Peter Cushing never plays the role exactly the same way in any of the films. It is a very human, three-dimensional characterization that is fascinating. Cushing's Baron Frankenstein is one of the great actor and iconic role pairings. And of course, Cushing would have two of these in both his Baron Frankenstein and Van Helsing. But I think in the annals of Frankenstein, there are two great Frankensteins. You have Peter Cushing's Baron in 6 magisterial performances that are all vividly different but yet unified, and the original Colin Clive performance as Henry Frankenstein in the first 2 films of the Universal cycle, directed by James Whale. But all of this Hammer did comes under the steady, incredibly visual hand of Terence Fisher, who manages to completely create the Hammer Gothic style in one film. And you see all this stuff coming together. Curse of Frankenstein is a watershed film that is just so much fun to watch, but even more fun to return to and to study and to see how all this stuff came together, and is really the birth of the glory of the Hammer horror name. There's nothing else quite like it, and it's also extremely literate, which is, when you read all the reviews of how reviled the Hammer horrors were when they first started, particularly in their native country of Great Britain, it's astounding, because these are incredibly literate, incredibly well-crafted films that are all about quality and intelligence and high ideas, with just the nice amounts of gallows humor and the red blood but little tiny details that made them feel so much more alive, as when Baron Frankenstein cuts the head off the corpse of the highwayman when he starts to build his creature, and merely wipes his bloody hand on his coat lapel, and that's the only blood you see in the scene. And as he's doing dialogue, Peter Cushing just rubs his hand. It's the little things like that. Or then he takes the head and dumps it in the bath of acid. And of course, we don't see anything, although apparently some of this was shot. We don't need to. It's the impact and the feeling of making this feel more vibrant and real. The fact that we get the sense of what it would be like to take scalpels to body parts and corpses and then have to sew them back together. But again, we don't have to see any of this. It's getting the impact of it. This is all heightened by Christopher Lee's amazing performance as the creature, a real one-of-a-kind characterization of this incredible diseased thing that did not ask to be and doesn't even know what it is really, with a truly iconic and one-of-a-kind original makeup by Phil Leakey that completely goes away from the iconic Jack Pierce makeup of the Universal films, and it speaks to the creativity of Hammer at this point, because they had to avoid copying Universal. They were terrified of being sued. This was long before Universal made made them a deal and allowed them to vividly and completely pull from the Universal films. And that's part of why the Hammer Golden Age is from the first years, where they had to really use their minds and be as creative as possible, because they had to avoid getting sued. And of course, they wouldn't have won those lawsuits, and they had no money, so it wouldn't have gone well. But it forced them to be creative, and that's part of the magic of the initial films, I think. But Curse of Frankenstein is one of those films that just grows every time you come back to it. It's a masterpiece of economy. It's brilliantly paced and has a very intricate bookending flashback design, because the whole film is told by Baron Frankenstein in flashback. It opens with him in prison awaiting his final sentencing. And it's the best introduction to the notion of what Hammer horror could be. It is the film that I think everybody should start with if they're wanting to get into Hammer horror. And I think a lot of people today would find maybe it's a little slow here and there, and also be surprised that it is very intellectually driven. It allows you to savor elements and things, which I think is one of the key elements of the horror film that has been lost, with everything today being about gore for gore's sake and little to nothing else. And there's a wonderful classical element too. The film has it's very classy. It has a classical feeling to it. It is a tried and true Gothic tale, and it is beautiful in every single way. And its importance cannot be understated. It is a masterpiece of the horror genre. It is one of the great films, and it is incredibly inventive. And it's just one of Hammer's absolute works of true magic. 1957's The Curse of Frankenstein. Now, in terms of video releases, Curse had a long and varied video history, frequently not looking or sounding the greatest. Unfortunately, it seems that perhaps maybe the original negatives are long since lost or deteriorated beyond the point of no return. So everything kind of varied. The DVD was pretty solid, and it is under Warner Brothers, but that was bare bones, and that's all we really had for years. It was basically based off of the late release Laserdisc. That's very rare. Then eventually, when Hammer Films started doing restorations and releasing Blu-rays in Europe, they commissioned a new version that turned up here on the British release. And this has some nice extras to it, and it also presents an alternate 1:37 open matted ratio of the film, which is not how it was exhibited anywhere, but how it used to be on the old VHS and cable and television broadcasts. Now, I do still think this release has some great extras. It is region locked, so you will need Region B capability. Most of us got this years and years ago. Unfortunately, the transfer is very soft. It is apparently based off of the Warner Brothers preservation elements of color separations, because that's the best that anybody has. But it was just, while it was at least an upgrade over the DVD because it was HD and it had nice extras and a commentary, it's just really soft and mushy looking. It did restore the iconic eyeball shot, which had been missing on all previous video releases, when Cushing's Baron Frankenstein gets the eyeballs and it dissolves back to the lab, and he's looking at the close-up of the eyeball through the magnifying glass. Well, the close-up of the eyeball had been missing for decades. So this release did put that back. So it is a very mixed bag, but I think it's still important to hang on to for the extras. But it's definitely not the way to go currently, because thankfully, and with great surprise, which seemed almost out of nowhere last year in 2020, Warner Archive announced and then released what I think is one of the greatest Blu-rays ever released on the format, which is their 2-disc special edition of The Curse of Frankenstein, using beautiful original foreign poster artwork to give it a certain identity to the cover. This is a brand new transfer from the Warner preservation elements, and they really achieved miracles with these color separations. The restoration work done on this is just out of this world. The film looks brand new, and I don't think it could possibly be improved upon in terms of the picture. It is stunning, and especially when you compare it to what we had on the British release. It is... To say it is a night and day difference does not even begin to describe the quality difference level. This with good reason, was tied for my best disc of 2020. It is frequently on sale. I was just on sale at Amazon for, I think, $13. There is no reason why you should not have a copy of this, because it also is one of the rare Warner Archive discs that is a full special edition. It is a 2-disc affair with fantastic special features, including a brand new commentary that goes into, as before this release, unheard detail about the drafts of the film's screenplay, and also with, again, not just talking head pieces, but legitimate featurettes with true horror great historians who actually go into detail. They're not just little 5 or 10 minute fluff pieces. These are full-on 20 to 30 minute talking essays, really. Again, this was amazing because Warner Archive usually doesn't have the budget and doesn't do extras. And on top of all this, just to really make this the definitive release in terms of that nobody could complain about anything, Warner Archive presents 3 ratios. So we have what I think is the proper 1:6:6 ratio, and then the 1:8:5 ratio, which would have been the American standard at the time, and the 1:3:7 opened up presentation, which is on disc 2, so it doesn't use up too much bit rate on disc 1 by having 3 different presentations of the film on one disc plus extras. So you have 3 different ratios spread across 2 discs and a boatload of extras plus a fantastic new commentary. This is the best release of a Hammer film on Blu-ray, I think, to date. And it's amazing that Curse of Frankenstein finally got this treatment. It royally deserves it. This is one of the best Blu-rays ever released by anyone. It is staggering, and I am so beyond thrilled that now we finally have a fantastic, practically archival version of Curse of Frankenstein on disc that is inexpensive, that everybody can pick up and finally experience the first Hammer Gothic horror the way it should be. And of course, my number one, I think this is pretty much a given. I almost put Curse of Frankenstein at the top, but this film is the definitive Hammer horror film. It is the one that is the most renowned, the most written about, and with good reason. So, of course, at number 1, as the greatest Hammer horror film of their Gothic horrors, is the 1958 masterpiece Horror of Dracula, or the UK title was simply just Dracula. This was the first of Hammer's Dracula films, again directed by the great Terence Fisher, with the rest of the Hammer team, from Jack Asher to James Bernard to Bernard Robinson to the immortal team of Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, playing their most at their most iconic in terms of playing Van Helsing and the Count himself. It really refines the Hammer style that began of Curse of Frankenstein and had progressed, but also really amps up and fully defines the sexual undercurrent that became a core part of the Hammer horror identity, but was fitting because it is a part of Stoker's original novel, and no Dracula or vampire film had really tackled this explicitly to this point by 1958. And again, it is, of course, while it was reviled on release by the original critics, it is a highly literate, extremely classical, extremely, and very surprisingly, a very religious film in places. It is a very spiritual film, in spite of everyone focusing on the sexual undercurrent. And in that way, it does perfectly transpose what is in the original Stoker novel. And it's a masterpiece of screenplay writing. Jimmy Sangster manages to outdo himself in his work on Curse of Frankenstein, because Dracula is a long, rambling novel told via journal entries, diary entries, newspaper clippings, and goes on for hundreds of pages. It is a classic book, but it is a nightmare to try and adapt. And that is why I've always felt that most Dracula films usually fail at capturing the spirit of the book and don't do a very good job of it. No one, just like Shelley's Frankenstein, no one has ever quite just gone and shot the book. And I do think the Hammer's Horror of Dracula is not only the best adaptation of Dracula and the best Dracula film, it is the best vampire film ever made. And I'm not simply speaking in absolutes. It manages to condense Stoker's novel down to 80 minutes and do it in such a way that it maintains the scope and the spirit and the elements of sexual repression and the elements of spirituality, and does it in such a way that just feels effortless. And it is where Curse of Frankenstein is the watershed moment for everything being set up as the foundation for Hammer horror. It's where everything starts to come together. Horror of Dracula is where everything does come together. It is Hammer's supreme motion picture in terms of their horror films, and it remains one of the crown jewels of the entire horror genre, and is still unsurpassed in terms of the Dracula mythos and Stoker's original novel, and telling this story with such an element of both the gothic but also the completely earnest, and with that sense of classical style. It is an absolutely beautiful film, from its characterizations to its pacing to its tightness of script. From its photography, Jack Asher manages to build upon his experimenting with color in Curse of Frankenstein and add even more layers and dimensionality to his color photography, which has caused many problems in trying to transfer the film in terms of the video releases, which I'll get to in a moment. James Bernard creates what is quite possibly his most iconic score from the opening, literally from the opening Dracula theme. It is basically just a jackhammer into your chest in terms of the intensity and the editing, the pacing, the performances across the board are incredible. But of course, one must most focus on the performances of Christopher Lee as Count Dracula, who was really never better in the role, I don't think. But then again, I don't think Dracula in the Hammer films was ever really written that well or given much to do. And of course, Peter Cushing's Van Helsing is just absolutely incredible in the other of Cushing's legendary, iconic performances. It's rare for an actor to have an iconic role, let alone multiple ones. Christopher Lee had several, and Peter Cushing has several as well, but the two primary ones being the sort of part of the focal points of Hammer's most enduring and their longest-running horror film series of Frankenstein and Dracula. But Horror of Dracula is Hammer's crown jewel. I don't think that's a far-fetched statement to make. I think pretty much everybody would agree with that, because it was so groundbreaking in terms of adding in that sexual connotation that was maybe hinted at a little bit in Curse of Frankenstein, but here it is definitely felt and there. But again, Horror of Dracula is all the more intricate and beautiful because it's never hitting you over the head with this stuff. It is not gore or sex for simply the sake of sensationalism. Everything is deeply felt, particularly in the various stakings that we see in the film, which was another sort of lightning rod moment for the horror genre, just as a specific example of how effective this film is. And it builds to the final act climax that manages to recreate the final long chase back to Transylvania and Dracula's castle from Stoker's novel, but does so with the Hammer economy and suddenly launches into a lightning climax that is one of the great horror film endings and one of the great film endings, and is I think the greatest ending to any Hammer film, and the one that is the most affecting. So that in and of itself, the ending of Horror of Dracula, the very ending itself, I think is a masterclass in every element of film production and should be studied. Just as the whole film should be studied for its production. And just like the rest of the Hammer films, it is absolutely just endlessly fascinating to study and to learn how this film was put together and how it was made, and figure out how all these pieces came together. And again, no one at Hammer thought they were making great films. They were just pushing themselves as much as they could and fully engaging their creative drives, and managed to create not just great films, but I think mostly in this early golden age of Hammer, they managed to create true works of art and true masterpieces, of which Horror of Dracula is, I think, the company's greatest. And I think it is a very easy and safe thing to say that, because it is just undoubtedly not just the key Hammer film, but still to date the greatest Dracula film and the greatest vampire film that has ever been made. And I am, of course, a gigantic, lifelong fan of the original 1931 Universal Todd Browning film with Bela Lugosi, and I think Lugosi as Dracula, just as Edward Van Sloan as Van Helsing, is iconic. So, I think there are the three great real vampire films. You have Horror of Dracula, the 1931 Dracula, and the 1922 Nosferatu primarily. But Horror of Dracula manages to get the spirit of Stoker personified in film form, which is amazing, and no one else has ever done it or been able to pull it off, I don't think. And you have all of this under the incredible direction of Terence Fisher. I think you can look at this film and completely understand, in every sense of the word, what a director does and how a director makes every scene breathe and have a life and a vitality, right down to even the smallest of character performances. So I do think this is the textbook on why Terence Fisher was a great director, why Hammer horror is so important, and why this is the greatest Hammer horror film. Now, unfortunately, Horror of Dracula, or just plain Dracula, has had a host of video issues and has run into a lot of problems. And unlike Curse of Frankenstein, Warner was not able to pull off a massive restoration save, or at least not as of yet in terms of their current efforts. So when Hammer decided to do their version, they also had the benefit of the long-lost Japanese reels being discovered, with the additional footage primarily of the final approach of Dracula and the legendary uncut version of the climax and Dracula's dissolution, complete with the amazing still we had seen for decades of Christopher Lee clawing his own face off. So we do have at least a version that tries to incorporate some of that missing footage, and that turned up in the UK Blu-ray release. So this includes both the original theatrical release version that we're used to, plus a new edit that tries to incorporate the missing footage that survived from the extremely deteriorated and worn Japanese print from a Japanese archive that was still, it's one of the great, amazing film preservation finds, I think, of practically ever, because it was really just almost felt it was a myth that Hammer made these export versions for the Japanese market that had the censored footage that was not allowed in the US or the UK. So that, along with this version's extras, means that this is an important release, and one that I do recommend people to pick up, simply to have the long lost footage, which is thankfully presented separately as the source HD scan from the archive, so you can actually watch all the reels with the hard-coded subtitles and the terrible damage and things, which I find fascinating, because outside of the damage and some things, it actually is. You can tell how nice looking it would have been brand new. But unfortunately, this uses the 2007 BFI restoration as its base. And while that is to be commended for its intentions, they unfortunately decided on a very cold blue color timing for the film, and that carries over to this British release, which means that Jack Asher's photography is really compromised. I personally cannot stand this color timing. I think it looks quite terrible and is not what you would see on original dye transfer prints from 1958. It's not on any other version of the film, and frankly looks quite bad. So I don't watch this version, but I picked it up for the extras and for the uncut Japanese reels. Should also mention that the extended version on this release, what they call the 2012 Hammer version, that tries to incorporate that footage, The first little bit of footage is relatively seamless, but the actual footage of Dracula's demise, that is from the lost Japanese version, the edit doesn't quite work, and also the scoring, when you look at that, when you look at the Japanese reels, is different slightly from the original theatrical release. So in order to try and edit the uncut footage fully back into the theatrical version, unfortunately, it doesn't quite work. It is a little bit jarring here and there. It is amazing to see in context of what we're used to and cleaned up a bit, but unfortunately they once again applied that same BFI color timing to it. So when this film gets properly restored with high resolution, a 4K scan at least, things like that, a new restoration would have to probably again do a fresh scan of the Japanese materials, and a new effort would have to be made to better incorporate that footage, particularly in the ending, to a proper restored version with the uncut material presented as probably a separate branching feature from the original theatrical release edit. But again, there are some great extras on here and a really nice commentary. So this is actually very inexpensive. It's frequently on sale, but again, it is Region B and it is locked, so you will need Region Free capability. But this has all the great extras, and it has the most important thing, the uncut Japanese reels, which you can view separately without the crappy BFI color grading on it. So I do recommend this. I do think it is essential to have, because we don't have any of this stuff in the US, but I can't recommend actually watching the film presentation on here, because I think the color grading, along with some other things, is just really subpar. Then we got a nice surprise in 2018 when Warner Archive announced and released their version of Horror of Dracula. Again, beautifully using some alternative European original poster art with the US title, but unfortunately, they either, I guess, didn't have the materials or the time or the money to mount a full-scale restoration, which they've done this with some other Blu-ray titles where it's really just a matter of getting it out in the US. But this reuses the 2007 BFI master. So this is the same master as the UK disc, but they did do an intensive color correction pass. So this actually fixes all of the color problems and looks fantastic. But with a caveat, there is a major problem in that in fixing the color, it somehow elevated another problem on the UK release, where a lot of the black levels are kind of clipped off. So when you look at this version, a lot of the edge of the frame, particularly it almost makes a sort of like an old silent film circle iris effect. If you look at the extreme edges of the frame, you'll notice it's very dark, and a lot of the shadow detail and actual black levels are sort of clipped off. And this is actually a problem in the UK version when you really look closely at it. If you were tweaking this on your television, trying to balance out some of the harsh blues, it becomes much more apparent that black level issue is baked in to this UK version. So unfortunately, while the Warner Archive version is it's the only Blu-ray here in the US, and it is inexpensive, so this is the version I recommend to people. But with that notion in mind that it does have the problem with the black levels, and because they did go in and fix all the color, it seemingly elevated that issue, so it's much more prevalent than it is in the UK disc. Also, this does not have any of the extras. It has actually no extras, and it also doesn't have any of the recently discovered uncut footage, which is unfortunate. So that makes it all the more important that you have to have the UK release. So this is one where I think you have to have both, really, and then you have to pick your poison in terms of which transfer you want to look at. So I know some people are okay with this, some people don't like it, some people like the UK version. There is now a German release, or a European release, that includes not only this Warner version, but that includes an alternate master that seems to be actually like a higher res version of the old DVD version. So that one seems to be pretty decent, and the old DVD was a bit too bright and had a bit too much in the reds and was a little bit overcropped dropped here and there, but it's still pretty solid and holds up pretty well. So if you don't like either the Warner Archive Blu-ray or the UK Blu-ray, and you kind of like the old DVD, you can import that. I believe it's a German disc that has that master as well, which I would like to get just to check out for myself. So there are technically now 3 different versions you can look at, but again, it's never quite easy with Hammer Films, and so for their crown jewel, I think it's of course fitting that there's a number of releases and none are quite perfect. All feature the original mono mix and sound fine, but we still have yet to get a proper definitive archival version and a new restoration. This is one that myself and pretty much everybody else I know hope Warner Archive comes back to, especially since now that they've done Curse of Frankenstein in such a beautiful manner and didn't really announce it. This is probably more of a stopgap measure. It may just be that they don't really see they can do anything beyond the 2007 BFI restoration as of now. Maybe the elements just aren't there. But honestly, if that's the case, I think now in 2021, tools and digital technology has improved since 2007 to the degree that we could do a new scan of the same elements in 4K and proper color grading, and at least get away from the issues of the black levels, and also do a new version that tries to incorporate and properly does an actual good edit of the uncut material, and actually finally bring that Japanese footage over here to the US, because it's still because that was discovered in 2010 2011, and here it is about 10 years later, and most people in the US haven't seen it outside of news articles. There is no disc release of any of the uncut footage here in the US. I think it's about time that we finally take another stab at Horror of Dracula, because we are still without a proper definitive release as of yet. So that's of course why I've got 2 versions on Blu-ray. I would like to finally find the Warner Laserdisc just to check that version out, but it is quite pricey and rather elusive. And then, of course, I also have to find the German disc as well. So that's it for my top 10 Hammer horror films. Again, this was a very difficult list to put together, and if I thought about it a little bit longer, I'd probably change it all over again. It's very hard to rank these films in terms of preference, but I think it is fitting that all 10 of these are directed by Terence Fisher, who is really the key Hammer director, and I think the real soul of the Hammer horrors, especially the gothic horrors that the company's most known for. And I think there is a distinct difference in the Terence Fisher films versus the non-Terence Fisher films. Again, not to belittle or put down the work of any of the other Hammer directors, but Terence Fisher really is the key Hammer director, and he is the person you think of and most associate with Hammer and the Hammer horror films. So please leave your comments below about your own personal favorite Hammer horror films, or if you want to try and make your own top 10 Hammer horror list, or if you have any comments about the various video releases of the films, or you also want to bemoan the fact that certain Hammer films still don't have a definitive release as of yet in 2021, please feel free. I'm always happy to hear from other fellow classic horror enthusiasts. And as always, keep your disc spinning, keep Visco Media alive, and thanks ever so much for watching.